What's up, everybody? It's Charles. Today we get to figure out why the check engine light came on the R32. So a couple of days ago I was driving the R32 around and bing, the check engine light popped on. Luckily, I have a really awesome instrument cluster where I could pull faults right on the cluster and see what was going on. Basically, I pulled two codes, System Lean Bank 1 and System Lean Bank 2. I was also able to pull up the measured value blocks, which is where we go to read the engine data. And it confirmed that both at idle and off idle, we had a lean condition. So today I'm going to walk you through the process of diagnosing this type of fault. Now there's a million things that could be wrong with this car and cause this fault. There's no way I can cover every single possible scenario that could cause a system lean fault. So what I want to do is talk about the approach to fixing this problem. Before we dive in, we need to understand what this code even means. What does system lean mean? Essentially, we have too much air coming into the engine that's not being accounted for. The way this car is set up, air is pulled in, past the air filter, through the air intake, past a mass airflow sensor that reads how much air is actually coming through. Air goes into the engine, goes through the combustion process, and then goes out the exhaust. Our ECM compares what the mass airflow reading reads coming into the engine versus what our oxygen sensor sees coming out of the engine. And then we have our post-catalytic converter oxygen sensor that kind of verifies that first oxygen sensor. So somewhere we're pulling in unmetered air, or we don't have enough fuel, or we have the perception of unmetered air, which means we could have an electrical component like an oxygen sensor or like an airflow meter failing, making the ECM think that we have too much unmetered air, but in actuality, it's just the sensor that's the problem. Let's get our VACCOM hooked up and look at our readings there and see what we got. At some point, we'll probably need this car running since we're dealing with an air-fuel ratio issue. So at that point, what I'll do is I'll pop the garage door open, back the car out a little bit so we don't fill the garage with toxic fumes. If you are working on your car, please make sure that you do not run your vehicle in a closed garage. First thing we are going to do is we are going to open up our VCDS. We'll also go ahead and turn our ignition on. Now, I have a battery maintainer hooked up to the car because we're going to have the ignition on with the key on. If you're going to have your key on for extended time, be sure to put a battery maintainer on it. Now, if this were a CAN bus car, I would recommend doing a full scan of the entire vehicle, and that's going to take forever. Let's jump right into the engine faults and see what we got. Go to 01 engine. Something else to note, my car does have a United Motorsports tune on it. That's why you see this United R32 in the component box right here. We'll go to our fault codes. 3 faults found now. It looks like we added a third one since my initial check. So we have a long-term fuel trim additive air, Bank 1 range 1, P1151 system 2 lean, mixture regulation bank 2, P1089, lean limit exceeded, and an idle control system RPM higher than expected. These 3 faults are probably the exact same problem. We have a system 2 lean, bank 1. We have a lean limit reached, bank 2, which that generally means we have something impacting both banks. This almost always means we have an issue upstream. If this were only on one bank, we would be looking at maybe that oxygen sensor or that side of the exhaust manifold or something like that. Since we have codes on bank 1 and 2, this means we have something affecting the overall engine, so it's upstream. Perhaps a mass airflow meter or a vacuum leak. And this idle control system RPM higher than expected. This is the car compensating and raising the idle so it doesn't shut off. And I did experience a pretty high idle on the way home after this check engine light came on. So we are not going to clear these. We are going to go back and see just how lean our car is reading. We'll go to our measured values. We'll go 32. This is our fuel trim readings. Wow. Okay. So we have adaptation at idle and part throttle for bank 1. We have adaptation for idle and part throttle bank 2. What we're looking at here in these positive number percentages is the amount of extra fuel the ECM is adding to our engine. We can see that 4.5 and 4.5 at idle, bank 1, bank 2, and 8.6 and 9.4 off idle. I'm not concerned that these two numbers are different. I'm just concerned that they are actually pretty high. This is a positive number, which means we are adding fuel to our air-fuel mixture. That's because the ECM is seeing a system lean fault, unmetered air, not enough fuel, too much air. If these numbers were negative, we'd be dealing with a system rich condition, too much fuel or not enough air. Something else to keep in mind, this is a 3.2 liter naturally aspirated engine. If this were a turbocharged engine, we would be dealing with these numbers being a little bit different. If we had unmetered air coming in at idle, 4.5, under a boost condition, we would probably see this number be negative because we're going from pulling extra air in a vacuum situation, at idle say, to pushing air out under boost. If you guys want to learn more about this, I did an entire video talking all about system leans and how it impacts these readings. I'll link it up. I highly recommend you check it out. So while these numbers aren't pegged at plus or minus 25, it's clearly enough to turn the light on. There's some other values that we can look at as well. We can look at 33. This is going to show us our voltage for our oxygen sensors. So while these are correction numbers, these are more like real-time what the oxygen sensors are seeing. Right now it's reading 0 and 0, and we just have these static voltage numbers because our car is off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to back the car out of the garage a little bit, and let's fire it up and see what these readings actually are while the car is running. All right, we got the car running, and you'll notice our oxygen sensor readings didn't actually change. We need to make sure that the car is up to temp and actually in our closed loop monitoring before we start messing around with our fuel trim readings and trying to diagnose it. We're trying to diagnose a correction issue here where it's not actually doing any correction. So step one is going to be let the car run a little bit and warm up until we start seeing the oxygen sensor readings change. What I like to do while the car's warming up is do a visual inspection and see if we see anything obvious. Maybe if a vacuum line is broken, we'll see it right away and we can nip a problem in the butt very quickly. As you can see, there's a bunch of plastic vacuum lines, hoses, intake manifold on this engine. Now, initially on my inspection, I can hear a pretty significant noise coming from under the hood. That sounds like a vacuum leak. And I think I found our problem. This is a vacuum line that goes to the evap purge solenoid. This is the source of our noise, and I think this is going to end up being the source of our check engine light. If we go ahead and cover this up, the idle smooths out a little bit, and that noise completely goes away. Once the car warms up, we'll be able to see these values in the scan tool, hopefully, and determine whether this is the problem or this is just one of a few problems. So here we can see our broken or vacuum line that has come loose. This one goes down to the purge valve right down here. This side goes directly to the intake manifold. I don't care so much about plugging this side, even though it will fail an evap leak test. That's not what we're dealing with. This is also a repair that somebody's made over some point of this vehicle, because that hose should actually be small enough to fit right here in this channel. So what we're going to do is we're going to find something to block this off with, and it may just be as simple as taping it. Start our car back up and see how it impacts our numbers. All right, our car is up to temp now. We can see in measured value block 1, field 2 and 3. That's pretty much our real-time fuel trim adaptation numbers. When we move to 32, we can think of that as a longer-term trim. Field 1 is going to be bank 1 at idle. Field 2 is going to be bank 1 off idle. Field 3 is bank 2 at idle. Field 4 is bank 2 off idle. Now, you'll notice that in 01, fields 3 and 4, they match 33.1 and 33.3. I'm going to plug that vacuum line, and we can watch our numbers change. From there, we should be able to determine whether that's our problem or just one of a couple of different issues. So immediately, the engine's quite a bit quieter. Now, we'll notice what happened to field 1, 3, and 4. It pegs to negative 25. That's because our longer term readings are also so positive. What we should see, if that's our only issue, is measured value block 1, field 3 and 4, go all the way negative, and then start to work their way back to 0, or even maybe a little bit of a positive number. And just after a few seconds, we're seeing these numbers negative 12.5, negative 13, 12.5, negative 9. So we're starting to try and hit that perfect, right, that perfect air-fuel mixture of 0.0. We're also noticing that our idle numbers on 32 here are coming down as well. Now, what we're not seeing is we're not seeing our off-idle numbers change at all. And why do you guys think that would be? Well, the easy answer is we're not off idle. We still have the car at idle. So we're not going to be able to change those numbers until we actually bring the RPM up and load the engine up a little bit. Or actually, the better way to do it is to drive the car. So now what we're seeing is we're seeing these numbers go positive, 0, negative, 0, positive. And that's exactly what we want it to see. We want the O2s to sweep. We want our oxygen sensors to go reading too lean, reading too rich, reading too lean, reading too rich, because the average is what we're actually looking at. Now we're seeing on measured value block 32, field 1 and field 3 go down to a negative 1.9. If that was the reading, I'd be super cool with it. Let's go ahead and bring the RPM up just here in the shop and see what it looks like when we do that. And then if it doesn't change enough, we'll actually go ahead and leave our vacuum line plugged and drive the car, and that should get us a different reading. So we noticed that absolutely nothing changed. What the problem is we don't have enough load on the vehicle in order to influence that change. So really the only thing we're gonna be able to do is test drive the car and see where our numbers come back at. Now you'll notice that I didn't clear the fault yet, and it's already starting to normalize. At some point, if this is what our issue is and we fix it, that light would go out. The key thing is you don't want to blow that fault out right away and erase all your adaptations. That's going to actually result in you having to take longer to diagnose the problem with the car. So I'm going to shut everything down, go drive it, and we'll come back and look at our readings again. All right, let's jump back in our scan tool and see what readings we have now. We'll, of course, double check our codes. They're still there. That makes sense. Now we will go into our measured value block 132. So notice now our idle numbers are quite a bit lower here in field 1 and field 3. Our off-idle adaptations are still kind of the same, and this could mean a couple of things. One, it could mean we just didn't drive it enough, and it needs more time in order to start to really impact these numbers, or we have another issue. We're at the point now where we really want to make a decision. Do we fix what we know is wrong and keep going, or do we leave this hodgepodge repair on and drive it more? Well, unfortunately, this jerk customer didn't leave enough fuel in the car to really put a solid test drive on it. So I'm going to take that vacuum line and I'm going to put it back together the way it was, half-handedly fixed. I want to say that hose is like $130 for that entire piece. So we may wait on replacing it, but I might go ahead and make a repair to it and reevaluate these numbers. So at this point, it's time to make the decision. Do we fix it, clear the faults out, and drive it and see if it comes back? Or do we do one more test? And this is where it's going to really be up to you in the situation. For me, I'm confident 100% that that was a problem, right? We saw that in our values. I'm pretty confident that it is the problem with the vehicle. So what I'm going to do is make that repair, clear the fault out, and drive the car and reevaluate it. If you were doing this for a customer, you might want to let the customer know, hey, we need to put a new one of these hoses on so that we can go to the next step. What would our next step be? Well, we could smoke test the intake manifold and see if we have another leak. We could do the same thing with the exhaust and see if we have an exhaust leak. We could check fuel pressure to make sure that under load, we're actually getting enough fuel and it's not an air problem, it's a fuel problem. Any of those tests I would be 100% cool with. I'm also cool with, again, at this point, because we found a problem, clearing the fault, replacing the part, driving it again and reevaluating our fuel trim across the board, as well as setting readiness to make sure that we don't have another issue. Sometimes what can happen, especially with fuel monitoring and fuel adaptation issues, is it can mask another problem. Notice that that line came from the evap purge solenoid, but we didn't have any evap purge faults. Because the system lean adaptation was so much bigger of an issue, it may not have even ran that leak detection, pump, flow, or leak test because we had such a big fuel monitoring issue. So jumping back into our scan tool, let's go back. We'll go to our faults. Actually, what we'll do is we will go back to our measured values and we will add these to our log. That way, when we go back to evaluate, we don't have to go, oh, what was the number? We'll have it in our documentation. We'll go ahead and clear these codes out. Done, go back. We'll go to our basic settings, do our throttle body adaptation. So that's pretty much it. Now, I get that this is probably one of the easiest check engine light system lean diagnosis faults that you could ever come across. But the process and approach is always going to be the same. If we didn't find that vacuum leak, what would we have done? Well, I probably would have broken out the Ready Smoke machine and smoke tested it to see if there was a tiny leak versus one that was so obvious. We may have done a little bit deeper dive into our airflow meter readings to see what it read versus a known good car. We could have also done things like trick the airflow meter if we're suspect there. Maybe we create a vacuum leak or do some propane enrichment to push that number lean or push that number rich to see what the airflow meter reads. If we don't get any change in the airflow meter when we create a big vacuum leak, Well, we might have an issue with that, or with the wiring, or the connector, which was a super common Mark IV problem. Not so much on the VRs and the R32s, but on the 1.8s and the 2 liters, and even the diesels, that was an insane issue. If we didn't find anything there, we would maybe then go to the next level of looking at the exhaust a little bit deeper, maybe our oxygen sensors. The keys are here, guys, that we had both banks having an issue. So because we had both banks having an issue, it's probably not one bad oxygen sensor. It's probably not two bad oxygen sensors. We need to think of the things that would impact both banks, right? The left exhaust bank and the right exhaust bank, or bank 1 or bank 2, whatever kind of engine you're working on, it doesn't matter. It's something that's impacting both, not just one side. If this were a newer car, we would probably even want to go in and look at some of our stored data. When was the fault stored? What was the coolant temperature? What was the RPM? How long has it been on? This one won't give you how long it's been on, I don't think, but some of the newer stuff, if this were the Golf R, it would tell you exactly the date that it came on, which is crazy to me. So these are just some of the things I want you guys thinking about while you're doing check engine light diagnosis, whether it's a crazy, easy, basic problem like this, or it's something way, way, way harder. There's probably a bunch of people that if they ran into this issue on their car or their customer's car, would have loaded up that old parts cannon and put a fuel pump in it, put a fuel pressure regulator in it, put a valve cover on it, because that's a super common problem, right? All those things could cause the same issue, but it's that first visual inspection that so many people miss the step, right? It's like electrical diagnosis. When you don't check the fuse, you are shooting yourself in the foot. So I want you guys to be thinking on that mindset of what can I work easy to hard on? And then it's always worth doing one more test just to make sure you actually fixed it. In this case, it would be setting readiness and an extended test drive rather than fixed a problem where the vehicle has many. So guys, with that, I'm out. Hope you enjoyed this. This is super fun, and I'm really glad it wasn't something crazy wrong with the R32. As always, questions or comments, drop them down below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time. So we got our hose separated, our plug off. We're going to use this super cool high-test heat shrink. It's actually meant for sealing washer fluid lines from some old Volkswagen technical service bulletin, and it'll shrink down really, really small to both fit on this hose and this bigger hose that went over it. We'll get a little dabble of dielectric grease. Let's help that hose slide on a little bit better. We will also put a little on here, help our line go on a little bit easier. Slide our line on, attach our hoses together, and then we'll go ahead and slide our heat shrink over both of them. Once it's about halfway between both, we'll go ahead and heat shrink it. We'll go ahead and use our little butane torch with the shield on it. I know what your King of the Hill fans are thinking about butane, but this works really well, so we're just going to use it to heat shrink it up. Be careful here because you're working right near the fuel lines, so you don't want to cause any sadness there. In fact, normally I'd just use a heat gun if we had a little bit more room. All right, so there we go. We made the repair. This actually will probably last just fine. I do want to get this replaced at some point so we can actually route this properly rather than just having it tucked down here to the side. But that is a repair for another day. This one should be just fine.